Okay, welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about a buttload of things. So I decided for the last book review of the year I was going to do another top 5 list, and this time for the latter half of what I've read in 2022. But the problem is, there weren't a lot of standouts in the latter half of 2022. Like, there were a lot of books that I sort of liked and a lot of books I sort of didn't like, but very few that I was like, oh my god, absolutely, yes. And the ones that were like that were often the end of series, and it just didn't feel like it quite worked for that. So instead I'm going to do another popular theme of just my to-be-read shelf. We're going to start with the one I'm reading right now, which is Empire of Sin by Gary Christ. This one I got, I was looking for just a generalized history of Storyville and the Vice in New Orleans, and I was getting it partially because, I do a tour on the history of Vice and women's history in New Orleans, so this would be a very interesting and useful book for me. But I won't say much about it because I'm going to write a review about it, but so far I will say it's a very male-centric history of Vice in New Orleans. Then we have Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. Now this is a book that I did the rare thing. I almost never get 2 books by an author I've never read before. And I didn't realize I had gotten 2 when I bought this one and An Unkindness of Ghosts. I just didn't quite register that it was the same Rivers Solomon somehow. And I read An Unkindness of Ghosts and absolutely loved it. It's a very good book. Like, honestly, if I was doing a just top 10 books of the year, that one would definitely be on it. But it's a heavy book. And I wasn't entirely sure after having read it if I wanted to immediately pick up another one, especially one called Sorrowland. So this book is set on my shelf, waiting for me to get in the right mood. Then we have Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, Book 3, The Ship of the Dead. Now you might have noticed that while I do have a review for Book 1 of this series, I don't have one for Book 2. That's because I don't own Book 2 yet. I bought Book 3 by accident. This was in my secondhand store that's one of my favorite places to buy books, down in the corner, and I was just looking through and I saw Magnus Chase books and I was like, yeah, I should start that series. And there was an option of Book 1 and Book 3, and somehow I ended up walking out of that store with Book 3. So I ended up having to buy Book 1, and I read it and I liked it, but I won't generally buy a second book until I've finished the first one and liked it. And I just haven't gotten around to buying Book 2 yet. It's on my list. It's coming soon. Then we have Howl by Sean David Hutchinson. Now, I've read one of his books and absolutely effing loved it. It was one of the first books I'd read in a couple of years I really got devoted to immediately. Like, it had great tone, it was a good voice, it was an unusual voice, it had queer romance, which I do enjoy in a book, and I really wanted to read another one of his. And actually, as soon as I finished it, I immediately started, going through his backlog of books. And there weren't any others that really screamed to me, like, yeah, I'm definitely gonna like this. So I sort of just didn't order one for a while. But I finally went ahead and put this one on my list, even though, yeah, by synopsis, I'm not entirely sure that this is my usual fare. Like, this is a high school book, it involves werewolves, which I like, but from what I gather, it's going to have a lot of high school emotions, and that's not usually something I look for in a book. And I'm hoping that the author overwhelms my lack of desire to read that particular trope. Then we have The Cloud Roads. I'm also going to pick up here. Why are you so tall? The Serpent Sea by Martha Wells. This is another series by Martha Wells. I have not read any of it yet, but I really liked the first of her series that I read. So much so that I was willing to buy 2 in the next series. Now, it really annoys me that look at how well these 2 covers match. They are not going to be pretty next to each other on the shelf. But I'm really hoping I like the book anyway. I know nothing about it, but from the cover, I'm guessing there are going to be some people who can fly. I don't like knowing a lot about books before I pick them up. Then we have The Long War by Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter. I read the first one, and if you're interested in it, there is a review of the first one on this channel. The first one was called The Long Earth, and it's a sci-fi book, and the premise is there are multiple Earths sort of lined up adjacent to us in the universe along the way, and people discover how you can step from one to the other. And the first book is very much about human instinct to explore and to put their mark on things, and at the end of the first book, unexpectedly to me, like, it did not feel like an expected turn, there's suddenly a start of a war. And this book I know is going to be about that war. And even though I got this one from the secondhand store, like, only a couple of weeks after finishing the first book, I haven't picked it up yet. And this is going to sound ridiculous, but a large portion of the reason I haven't picked it up yet is the cover is so yellow and orange. That screams to me that this book is going to be a lot more emotional, strifey, dark, and, you know, angsty than the first one was. And I don't know, man, I'm just not always in that mood. So even though it's Terry Pratchett and I can pretty much trust him not to lead me down a dark road, I've sort of been putting it off, and when I went to pick up a Pratchett last time, noticed I picked up Small Gods instead of this. So I'll get to it. Just not every mood kind of book. And last of the big books over here, we have Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis. So Lindsay Ellis is a YouTuber that I very much like. I'm actually very sad that she's not making content anymore, and I really wish she hadn't been canceled, even though, yes, I do understand why people did. At least why people talked to her. Like, I feel like that was one that, you know, could have been talked out, guys. But I knew she had published a book and I was vaguely interested in it. But my nephew was doing a fundraiser, and it was one of those fundraisers of you can buy random shit and he'll get credit for it. And of all the random books, this one happened to be on the list, as well as the sequel. Now, I'm not going to buy the sequel until I can be sure I'm going to like this one, because I will admit that I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to like Lindsay Ellis as an author, even though I like her as a YouTuber. That's not always the same thing. So I'm going to read the book first and see how I vibe with it. But also I'm a bit curious about the themes. Like, I know from watching snippets of her, like when she mentioned it passing on YouTube, that I know that the book does involve the trope of monster love, which is something I enjoy. It can be good. Also, I know it's set in the 90s. I know it's vaguely sci-fi. I know it involves aliens. And, like, that could be good. I'm just not sure. And I will admit, if it had not turned up on that fundraiser page, this one probably would have been a lot lower down the list of things for me to buy. But I'm interested. Then we have Industrial Magic by Kelly Armstrong. This is another one of those books that I found in a secondhand store, and it is not a book I would have bought anywhere except for in person. It was one of those books that just walking by, I'm like, I read the back of the cover, I'm like, sure, it's not that expensive, I'll buy it. From what I've gathered, like just from glancing at the back of the cover, I feel like this is gonna be in the same genre of fantasy as like the Anita Blake books. Like, that fantasy that is sort of almost towards horror, but without all the dark shit that actually makes you scared, just using horror concepts. I know it involves witches. I know the lead character is a female, and I just get the vibes that we're going to be into for some late 90s, early 2000s girl power, strong female lead kind of shit. But yeah, I think I'm going to enjoy it. Then we have The Road to Bedlam by Mike Shivden. This is one of the books that I read the first one ages ago, and I read it at a time period that I just didn't have a lot of excess money for buying extra books. So even though a lot of those books I did want to read the sequel to them, I just never got the sequels. They got added on a list and forgotten about. But when I was doing my reviews of books I haven't read in years, I came across a lot of them and it was like, oh yeah! So they got added to my actual wish list of books I'm buying soon. And I will admit the reason this one got bought first was not because it was the top of the list of possibilities. It was just because it was an excessively cheap paperback. Like, this one only cost me like $5 or $6, and I just need to spend like $5 or $6 more to get free shipping in an order, so I threw this one in. Now, that's not to say I don't want to read it. I definitely do want to read it. It's just, it's not like screaming out to me, read me now! I know that it's about a guy who was like a relatively like mild-mannered middle-aged guy who like in his 40s finds out he's actually secretly half Fae and gets mysteriously drawn into this convoluted plot to take over the world, I feel like it was. Maybe? Might have just been London. Might have just been like the mayor's office. I don't know. But I enjoyed it. But I do also remember that when I started the first book, The 61 Nails, by the way, is the name of the first book, it took me a while to get into it because Mike Sheavden is one of those authors that feels the need to tell you every detail of what is happening. And that's a style that I find a little bit difficult to jump straight into. But when I got into it, I remember really loving it. So I was excited about the second one back then, and I'm hoping to build up that excitement again soon. Then we have The Last Continent by Terry Pratchett. So I own a good portion of Discworld. I think I own about 20 of the Discworld books, but I recently decided that I wanted to fill in the gaps, because when I was buying Discworld back as a teenager, I bought whichever one suited my fancy in that moment. I wasn't paying attention to, like, what's the next one in the series. And eventually I was like, no, I want to own the entire series. I want to go through and fill in my gaps. And this is not the next one from the gap I was missing. But I put like 5 or 6 of them on my wish list as like, I'll get to these next. And this one was just at the top of the list, so my brain said it's the next one, so I went ahead and ordered it with the Small Gods book as well. And Small Gods was the next on the list, so that's why that one got read last. But Discworld, it's a great series. It's wonderful. You'll love it. I know The Last Continent involves like Discworld's version of Australia, but that's pretty much all I know about it. So really excited for this one. Then we have the Bartimaeus series by Jonathan Stroud. This is actually the first in the series, The Amulet of Samarkand, I think, which I'm pretty sure I owned before. I have no idea what would have happened to it, but I know I read it, and I'm 90% sure I owned it. But when I read the second one, I went to shelve it, and it was the only one on the shelf. And since then, I've forgotten most about this book. So when I was doing reviews of books I haven't read in years, I was just like, wait, where's the first one? And what happened in the first one? Did I read the first one? And I had this like complete crisis of, I'm not sure if I've read this book. I remember so little about it. So I decided to go ahead and buy it again and reread it. I know it involves a golem, and I remember when I first read it, spending like the first 20 chapters going, what time period is this book in? Like, it really bothered me for some reason. I couldn't figure out if this was meant to be a alternative version of modern world, or an alternative version of the 1950s, or an alternative version of the late 1800s. Like, I couldn't figure out which one it was, and that really bothered me for some reason. But I'm hoping that the second read, more of it will stick with me. Then we have The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This one I found in my secondhand store, which is good, because N.K. Jemison's an author I've heard a lot about. She appears on a lot of lists of like modern great fantasy authors. And her more recent books that they keep advertising to me, I don't know, they just don't call out to me. There's something about them that just doesn't feel like my vibes. So I've been going, I want to read a Jemisin, but I'm not entirely sure where to start. And when I saw this one on the shelf at my secondhand store for only like $5, I was like, okay, I guess I'm starting with that one. I, once again, know nothing about it, but I'm excited. Then we have The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. This is one that was recommended to be my best friend, Jasmine. And I will admit, I had forgotten that until Jasmine was here. I was looking at my shelf and was like, oh my god, you got The Watchmaker of Filigree Street? And I was like, yes. Once again, it's one that I know nothing about. I am guessing from the cover it's going to be steampunky, but I love getting to go into books that I know nothing about. Those are the ones that are most likely to get read soon. Those are the ones I'm probably going to read in, you know, the next 3 or 4 months. And yes, knowing me, I probably will buy more books and they will get piled on top and read more recently than some of these, but those will, I can be relatively sure that 90% of those will be read by the end of the year. And by the end of the year, I mean the end of 2023. But then there's an entire another collection of books. The ones that I think of as semi-permanent installations on my to-be-read shelf. But those are the ones behind me. We start with the Book of Enoch, which is actually a book I have started to read already. I made it that far in, so more than halfway. The Book of Enoch is one of the apocryphal books. It's not officially part of the Bible, but at different points in history it was considered part of the Bible. And it's one that a buttload of insane conspiracy theories and like the more out there theories about the Bible are tied to. And I was just really interested in it in a theoretical kind of way. But in the end, it was a bit like homework. It felt like I was reading this to learn about folklore, less about, like, for enjoyment. And objectively, it reads like, you know, books of the Bible. Very poetic, not always a lot of story. And the bits of story that were there I enjoyed, but just the slow sort of biblical poetry. Yeah, I stopped. I was like, I'm going to read something else for a minute so I can keep reading, and then I just never picked it back up. But it exists on my to be read shelf because I figured, you know, it's got less than 100 pages left. I can finish this at some point. Then we have The Long, Dark Tea Time of the Soul by Douglas Adams. This is the second of the Dirk Gently books, which I got because they were given to me by my now ex-brother-in-law, and it was a weird moment. Like, I just saw them on his shelf, and I was looking for something to, like, you know, connect with him and to talk to him about, and I was like, oh, the other Douglas Adams books, I've never read them. And he was like, do you want them? And I was like, yes? And I read the first one, and, like, it's not that I disliked it. I did enjoy it, but I found it very hard to not just get into, but also to stay into. It's a book that jumps around to a lot of different storylines that seem not at all connected in the beginning, and it's a lot of short segments, that some of which are rather absurd, so it's really hard for you to focus in on what's going to be the story, and that's something I need in a book. And because of that, I've had no desire to read the second one. It is still on my to-be-read shelf. Like, it's not to the level of I'm getting rid of it yet, but it's probably not going to be until that we have another blackout from a hurricane before I get to this. Then we have Feast for Crows by George R. R. Martin. This is, you'll notice, not the first of the Game of Thrones book. In fact, I think it's book 4. But this one I own because it was in a secondhand store for like 50 cents. And I figured if I bought the 4th one, eventually the first 3 would show up. And I mean, it's Game of Thrones. I'm gonna have to read it eventually. But I've just never really searched out the others. And partially because, and this is gonna sound terrible, but it's just a bit too popular. Now, I don't want to sound like one of those, oh, I'm not like other girls kind of people, and like talk trash about something just because it's popular. There's a reason I don't always like things that are popular. Like, a lot of the things that are super popular that I don't like, it's because they're book club fiction or they're literary fiction, and that's just not my cup of tea. But Game of Thrones, of course, is not that, but because it is so popular, in my brain, it's sort of categorized in the same area. There's also the simple fact of I know too much about it, because I have seen a couple of seasons of Game of Thrones on HBO. But also, I've seen dozens of trailers, I've seen 100,000 memes about it, I've seen complaints about it, and not just it, but also, like, House of Dragons. I know enough about this series that it feels like I'm not getting a clean slate for it. So at this point, unless the universe literally thrusts the first book into my hands, I'm probably not going to read it. But I'm also not going to get rid of this one in case the universe does thrust the first one in my hands, and then I'd have to buy the 4th one again, which why would I do that? Then we have Hollow City, the second novel in the Miss Peregrine's Peculiar Children series by Ransom Riggs. I read the first book of this one and absolutely effing loved it. Like, it was wonderful. I loved the weird stylistic tone of it. I liked the story. I loved the weird pictures. I just generally liked the book a lot. And it was read during the same time as the 61 Nails, at a time I couldn't afford to buy, like, a lot of extra books. So it sort of just sat there waiting for me to get the next one eventually. And between that time and when I actually came across enough money to buy a few books, the movie came out. And I was thinking, oh cool, a movie of the first book. I'll go see that. I loved the first book. And I didn't realize that it wasn't just a movie of the first book. It was a movie of all the books, squashed in together. So, like, you know, 45 minutes in, we suddenly surpassed what I knew and we're going into other territory. And I was like, oh, no, I haven't read this book yet. But that sort of put me off reading the others. And, like, that's unfair because the movie compressed the plot line of the last ones so much that, from what I understand, like, nothing in these books is in that movie except for the conclusion. And so, like, I know there's more, and it shouldn't have, like, ruined it for me, but yeah, that movie sort of spoiled the books for me for a while. But at this point, it's been long enough that my brain has sort of wiped that slate clear. I feel like it's safe for me to pick up this book and not feel like I've, seen a bad movie of it. Then we have Edgar Allan Poe, The Complete Tales and Poems. So this is another one that I have started reading, but you'll notice I have not gotten far, because I do like Poe. He is somebody that I enjoy, but in short snippets. Like, he's an author that I want to read one short story or a couple of poems, and then stop and read something else. And I did that like 4 or 5 times before I set the book aside and just haven't picked it up again. Now, does that mean I'm ever going to get rid of this? Absolutely not. It's a beautiful book, and also, I don't think I'm legally allowed to. I'm a goth kid. I have to have this. Isn't that true? But also, I do like Poe. It's just, I don't think I'm ever going to read it cover to cover. It's always going to be a pick up a couple pages, read a short story, read a poem or two, and then do something else. Because I just don't think I can handle sitting through, like, 800, 900 pages of his work in one sitting. Oh, I'm sorry, over 1,000 pages of his work in one sitting. Then we have the Book of Merlin, Insights from the Merlin Conference, edited by R.J. Stewart. So this is a compendium of essays about the historical and folklore figure of Merlin. I bought it right out of college when I was thinking, like, yes, I am studious now. I shall continue my studies. I shall be reading important works. And I've never picked it up since I brought it home. And that's sad, because Merlin is one of those topics I'm very interested in. Like, I'm very interested in the folklore of Merlin. And, like, if you present this to me as a YouTube, series, I would sit there and watch 4 hours of it. But I just have no desire to read this. I will, maybe, one day. Then we have The Lamplighters by, who? By Maria S. Cummins. This is a book that I got when I was designing a set, and I needed a good collection of books that looked like they were published pre-1950s. And the local library was doing one of their get rid of everything sales, where you can go in and, like, bring in a paper bag and just shove it full of books for $1. And so I did that. The theater company I was working with kept most of them, but this one vaguely interested me, primarily just because of the name. I know nothing about this book, but The Lamplighter, I mean, that has lovely vibes of, like, gas lamps and, like, Victorian something or other. So I figured I'd keep it and might one day read it. But I will admit, this is one of the few books on my TBR shelves that is entirely a might one day read it. Then we have Lamb by Christopher Moore. This is a book that was sent to me by my sister Emily, and we do share a lot of taste in books. Not perfectly share, but we share a lot of taste. Like, a lot of the books she loves, I like, and the books I love, she likes. There is very little overlap that we both absolutely love, but generally speaking, if she recommends something to me, I'm going to like it. And she loved this book. So I feel like I need to give it a try, but I will admit there's not much about it other than her recommendation that would ever get me to read it. Like, from what I gather, looking at it, it's pure satire, which is not a genre I tend to like. Like, unless it's Pratchett satire, I don't tend to glom onto it. But also, it's about Jesus, and I don't like reading a lot about Jesus. The books tend to either be very preachy or very dismissive, and therefore it makes me a bit nervous. And, like, the very concept of, the gospel according to Biff, Christ's childhood pal, feels so 1970s that I just haven't picked it up yet. Now, it is still definitely on my list. It's going to get read. It's just waiting for the right moment. Then we have Don't Bet on the Prince, a contemporary feminist fairy tales in North America and England by Jack Zipes. So this one is one of those books that a friend of mine had and was like, hey, I'm not going to read this. Do you want it? And I was like, I mean, sure. But I'm not entirely sure why I said yes, other than just like, my instinct to never let a book get thrown away. Like, neither the cover nor the subtitle draw me in much. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love feminism, I love fairy tales, but I find that when you combine the two, it often feels very pasted on top. Like, I much prefer, you know, stories that start out with a feminist tone and not just like, oh, we're going to take fairy tales and then we're going to turn them all feminist. So I'm not sure about this book, but just flipping through, I noticed that there are some authors that I know and like who've written for this. So I should pick it up eventually. Then we have The Historian by Elizabeth Kostov. This book was given to me by my dad. And the thing is, me and my dad do share some taste in books. We both are fans of Vonnegut, for one. But he gave me this book saying, oh yeah, I really think you'll like it. That really seems like an Elaine book. And I almost wanted to ask him, why? Like, from what I can gather, this is either historical or a mystery sort of based in historical fiction that's just... neither of those are my genre. And there's something about the presentation of it all that just reminds me of Dan Brown, and I'm just like, you know I would never read him, right? Like, he is not my wheelhouse. So, I'm not entirely sure why Dad thought I would like it. And because of that, I'm willing to give it a try, because that means maybe there's something in here that I don't know that just... maybe I'll like it. Maybe it'll be a surprise. And it sits there, waiting for me to read it, accusingly. Then we have Gumbo Yaya, Folk Tales of Louisiana. Speaking of books that sit there accusingly, this is like the compendium of all New Orleans and Louisiana folklore. But while I've tried it a couple of times, I've just never gotten further than like 2 or 3 pages at a time. And a lot of it's because I know there are new versions that sort of, you know, get rid of some of the more egregious moments, but, like, this is a book where the N-word appears a lot, and, like, there are a lot of stereotypes in it, and, like, that makes sense, because, like, it's New Orleans folklore, and yes, New Orleans is a place that there was a lot of racism, but it just always feels a little bit squirky when I pick it up. And, like, I've read segments of it because there are segments that have appeared on tours of mine that, like, the stories have been featured, so I've had to go back and see, like, what does basically the primary source say. And, I mean, it's useful for that. I've just never convinced myself to sit there and read through it. Then we have 2 books by Kurt Vonnegut. We have Look at the Birdie and Palm Sunday. And I like Kurt Vonnegut. I do. I enjoy him, but he's an author that just doesn't stick with me once I've read him. So the extreme desire to pick up his next book is never there. He's one of those authors that when I find myself reading his books, I really love them. But I'm not going to naturally natively pick him up. And especially not Palm Sunday, because it's missing the dust jacket. So there's like nothing about this that draws me in. But yeah, so I know I'll like him when I pick it up. It's just, there's nothing that really screams pick me up about them. Then there's Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, which is another book that I have already started. I have read a good portion of this book. Read to there. And I picked this one up right after college when I was like feeling like, oh yeah, I definitely need to keep reading classics because I missed a lot of classics in my education because Bennington is a weird school. And I need to read them and fill in the gaps of my education. And, like, Fielding is someone I like. I'll definitely love this. And it's one of those books that, like, if I'd had a professor telling me you have to read this many pages a week, I definitely would have finished it and absolutely loved it. But without that pressure to keep reading, I was very quickly distracted. And once I got distracted, I've just never convinced myself to pick it back up. So, yeah, these last 200 pages... it might be a while before I get to them, especially considering it's been so long since I read the first 500 pages that I might need to reread some of them. Then we have The Three Musketeers, another classic, Alexandre Dumas. This is another one that I own because it's a pretty cover. And like, yeah, after college I was looking for a lot of classics to fill in my gaps, but also I loved pretty covers, and I had my own money to spend, so it didn't seem like a bad idea to spend $25 on a pretty book. But I've never actually read this one, and like Dumas, he interested me when all I knew was the basic concept, but the more I found out about what's actually in this book, the less desire I've had to pick it up and read it. I will eventually read it, I promise, but who knows when. Before I die. It's on my bucket list, you know. Then we have Regina's Song by David and Lee Eddings. Now, the David Eddings books, the Belgrade and the Melorian. I read the Belgrade straight through, loved every second of it, thought it, like, it's one of my top epic fantasies. Loved it. The Melorian just wasn't quite hitting the same notes for me, like, it felt like a lot of covering the same ground, but just, like, nothing that really drew me in. And this one is, like, a side book. I know it has to do with the, like, powerful witch that appears in the series, but, like, also, I don't remember a lot of that series, and it's a heavy enough of series that I'm not gonna want to go back and read all, what is it, like, 14 books to try to remember where the hell I was. So this one, which I got long after I'd read the rest of the series, has just sort of sat on my shelf being like, you'll get to it eventually, right? Right? And so far the answer is no. Then we have Vittoria the Vampire by Anne Rice. Anne Rice is an author that I often have a couple of her books on my to-be-read shelf, and they often sit there for a very long time. Because while I do like Rice, I think she's a great author, she is super fucking purple. Like, there are so many more words in every single one of her books that need to be there. And that's just not something that I love all the time. Like, I sort of really need to be in the right mood for Rice, and she is an author that I simply cannot read 2 of her books in the same time. And I've also learned from experience, I can't go back and reread hers. Like, I have no interest on second read. So, yeah, this one's been on my shelf for about 6 or 7 years, which means it's getting to the time I'll probably read this one. I know nothing about it, except that, I mean, it's going to be in the Vampire Chronicles, because it has vampire in it, and it's not going to be one of the main series, because it's named after a specific random vampire, and those are always the side character ones. Then we have Blackwood Farm by Anne Rice. And the reason this one has particularly been on my shelf for so long is because it's the second in the Witching Hour series, and I read the Witching Hour, but it was a while ago, and there were bits of it that were missing in my mind, so it's like, I'm going to reread it. And I languished about halfway into the book and just could not get myself to read further. But because of that, I've never actually picked up the second one of the series. I'm hoping to eventually, and honestly, once I got about halfway through Witching Hour, I remembered a lot more of it than I thought I did, so I might one day just pick this one up, but I might reread, like, the wiki description of Witching Hour before I pick this one up. Then we have The Book of Lost Tales by Tolkien. I've only ever read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I have not read The Silmarillion. I have not read any of his additional tales. And I've never really had a strong desire to. Like, for me, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is a complete series. I don't need more backstory. And from what I've gathered, most of the rest of his writing is just backstory. The only reason I own these two is because I was part of one of those book clubs back in the 90s where they would send you, like, a catalog of books, and there were 2 or 3 books that were like that, if you don't tell us not to, we're gonna send you these. And these were some of those books. And I just forgot to send back the notice that month saying, don't send me those, I don't want them. So I own them, and I gave them to my sister for a while, because Emily was more of a Tolkien fan than I was, and she, being a much more history-centric person, I figured she would like them more. And she never read them, and somehow they ended up with me when we went our separate ways. So they've been on my TBR shelf since early high school. Who knows if they will ever get read? Then we have... Okay, this is Immortal Masterpieces of Literature, Plain Tales from the Hills, Ballads, Kipling. This is one of the books that ended up on my shelf in the weirdest way. So my sisters and I were buying my mom a nice chair to use for her easel when she was painting, because she has a bad back. And I was always the more passive person, and Emily was always the more like, I'm going to talk to the salesperson person. So when we found what we thought we liked, and Emily was talking to the salesperson, I was just sort of sitting there watching, going, oh yes, 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 I agree with this, yes. And eventually the salesperson went off to go like check stock and stuff, and out of boredom, the chair was set up at a desk that was set up to look like a fake office, and it had a huge collection of books on it just to like be set dressing. And I saw a Kipling book, so I just picked it up and started reading it. And when the salesperson came back, I was distracted, so I just kept reading rather than helping anybody. And eventually, like halfway through this transaction, the salesperson just looks up and he's like, hey, do you want that book? And I was like, what? And he's like, they're just set dressing. Nobody's gonna read them. Would you like that book? And I was like, yes. And I took it home and never read another page of it. Now the thing is, I do like Kipling. He's a good author. I will admit, I haven't read any of his since I reached adulthood, and I worry about that because even as a middle schooler reading it, I was like, wow, this is a little bit Eurocentric, and this is just a hair racist. So I'm a little bit nervous about going back and reading Kipling as an adult, but I want to. And he, if I remember, was very easy to read. So this is one of the classics that are pretty that I might actually read sometime in the next couple of years. Then we have Celtic Magic by DJ Conway. This is one of those books that I got at the height of my I'm into pagan shit because I'm a gothy teenager phase. And it was a book that seemed like a great idea when I was sitting in the Books A Million, but when I got it home and started reading it, I was like, ooh, this isn't quite what I would, this is not quite, oh. Some of it is like what I was looking for, like actual breakdown of like the stories of Celtic mythology. Like there's a little bit about the Tuatha De Danann, there's like breakdowns of what some Celtic names mean. There are a couple of, like, telling us who Celtic gods are, but not nearly as many as I wanted. But there's also a buttload of shit that's just like, this stone represents this. Wear hematite to shield you from dark forces. White equals spiritual guidance. And I'm just like, oh my god, that's not what I'm here for. Because even at my height of my floofy teenage years, I was always like, nah man, that's not what I'm here for. So, it's a book that I've sporadically read bits of and will occasionally, back in my teenage years, look it up and be like, oh, is there anything in this about, I don't know, ferns? Yes, there are. Ooh, male ferns represent male fertility. So, you know, I have it. Honestly, next time I do a culling of books, this one's probably going. But then we have Anne McCaffrey, The Dolphins of Pern. And I'll go ahead and grab the other Anne McCaffrey here at the same time, which will be the last of them, because these are the oldest books still on my TBR shelf. Like, all the others have been read that have been there longer. And Anne McCaffrey was my favorite author as a teenager. If you want more of my feelings on her, I have, like, my longest ever review book on her. Because just I got a lot of feelings about her. I fucking loved her when I was a teenager. And as an adult, I can barely handle her books, it turns out. And these last two, at this point, I honestly do not know if I'm ever going to finish them. Or for that matter, start them. I love Pern. I love the concepts of Pern. It turns out it did not age as well as I wanted it to. And I feel like when a book has been on your shelf for more than 2 decades, it might be time to give up the ghost and get rid of it. So yeah, that is my to-be-read shelf. You'll notice there are a fuck ton of books on it, some of which, yeah, I'll probably get to in the next couple of weeks or months. Some of which you might never see a review of, but they all exist on my shelf for a variety of reasons, and trying to convince me to get rid of most of them is next to impossible. So yeah, you might see some of these reviews coming up.